Hello YouTube, this is Boston Best 0407, and as what tends to be the case a lot with me, I found that I'm in a situation where, I feel like I didn't explain everything I meant, or that, what I explained maybe made me sound awkward, or I felt awkward when I had said it. And so now I find myself again, doing another video, which took me a while to do because I kept screwing up the audio. But I'm doing another video where I find myself having to explain, something that I meant. And of course, we describe myself as traditionalist conservative. And it becomes a little bit complicated because, one, I'm not using that in the way a lot of people use it. That's the first thing. The second thing is that a lot of people don't know what those terms mean. There's a lot of misconception as to what those terms mean. And this is particularly the case, when it comes to the parts of YouTube that I find myself surfing around in a lot. So this is why I thought I wanted to do this video, to really to break down what these terms mean in their proper sense. And when I describe myself as traditionalist conservative or traditionally conservative, what I mean by that is that, first of all, what I mean by that is that that's a temperament of mine. That is, it's a leaning. And I mean that in a lowercase t, lowercase c sense, as opposed to an upper t, uppercase c sense. So that's what I mean by that. But people, when they hear these terms, they usually assume you're a Christian. They usually assume you're in favor of, say, family values, that you want men to be disposable, so any number of these other things. And that's what people in, say, the men going their own way movement tend to feel. And it's not entirely unjustified. Because, traditionalism as it occurs in this day and age, it's gynocentric. There's no denying it. But it doesn't have to be that way, and that's not really what it means in its proper form. And it's really sad to me that these sorts of terms get so degraded and to such a point they don't actually mean anything to people. They don't mean what they originally meant. So I'm going to take this time out to first, I'm going to explain what these terms mean, without any sort of ideological significance. Then I'm going to break it down and explain what they mean in terms of ideological significance, and then I'm going to explain my own take on it. So to begin with, conservatism is the idea that you should essentially keep things the same. That really there really should be no point at which you radically speaking, choose to change things. That is, conservatism is against the idea of revolution, and it's against the idea of social engineering. The conservative does not want to be a social engineer. He does not believe that human beings are capable of changing in a meaningful way. He's in a sense a pessimist, and he completely rejects the idea of a kind of a social progress. The idea that humanity gets better. That's not what he believes. At all, and it's not how he thinks about the world. So he's a pessimist in a sense, but he's not necessarily even opposed to change. He feels change should happen organically, naturally. Human beings should just allow nature to take its course, in other words, and not actively seek to change the world. So that's what conservatism, its original and traditional meaning. That's what it originally meant years ago. It doesn't mean that now. It's come diluted today, but that's what it originally meant. Traditionalism is a little bit more specific, and a little bit more, in a sense, reactionary, and even in a sense idealistic. Whereas the conservative is against against idealism and ideology, works in reality and practical situations. The traditionalist is a little bit more idealistic. He wants to preserve traditional culture, and as I said in my second to last video, basically what a traditionalist is, he wants to preserve the culture, or the cultural institutions, the socio-economic and political institutions of an agrarian society in an era where those sorts of things have been degraded, or their economic base or their socio-economic base has been diluted and essentially obliterated. That's the traditionalist. And in a sense, the traditionalist wants to keep these sorts of things in a museum, in a sense. He wants to privilege them and respect them above newer institutions. So this is the traditionalist, in a sense. And again, these two things are temperaments. And really, in terms of hardcore, stronger, more defined ideology, they take it about, I would say, three separate forms. There's the first form, which is your typical mainstream conservative Republican view. And this really can be boiled down to traditional family values or traditional Christian morality, constitutional government, civil liberties to a certain extent, and free markets. That's the mainstream conservative view. And it's a rather boring, it's a rather bourgeois and kind of mediocre and undefined sort of situation. And this is where that whole gynocentric criticism has come in, where this sort of thinking, these guys want you to man up and marry those sluts, sort of thing. It's that kind of thinking. It's pander to females, and that's what the men going their own way thing is responding to. It doesn't have to be like that, and that's really a bad view of, and it's really a product of what these terms mean when they've been diluted in a modern era, because it doesn't have to be that way, and simply doesn't have to be that way. It's simply a perversion of what those terms really mean, and it they're really just diluted. Let me just say it like that. Just the dilution. How should I say this? They're diluted, basically. It's the dilution, if that's even a word. I'll make a word up. Dilution of the term. I'll make a word up. Anyway, so that's the first way. The second way is a more ideological, defined traditionalist conservatism. That is capital T, capital C. And this really can be broken down into, it can be really referred to as Toryism. It's really a form of Toryism, effectively. And the traditionalist conservative is really thinking in terms of culture, high culture, organic unity, hierarchy. He would favor probably, traditional forms of social organization that would have only really worked out in, say, a feudal society, monarchy, aristocracy, things of that nature. And this manner of thinking has its origins in the Anglo-American tradition. So, really, it's English in a sense. It's personified in the thinking of, say, Edmund Burke, and then in America, Russell Kirk, and it's also personified in the thinking of the Southern agrarians. It has its roots partly in the American South, and in a sense, it's really for a decentralized government, localism, patriotism. It's not nationalistic exactly. It favors all those things, but in an organic way. So the way people would relate to each other would be organic. It wouldn't be bureaucratic or mechanical, the way it tends to be in say a modern society with a modern state and so on and so forth. And there's a lot of people in the paleo-conservative movement that would lean in that direction. But the difference is that the paleocons are politically minded, whereas the traditional conservatives or the traditionalist conservatives of this variety are a little bit more interested in culture. It's more of an attitude. It's a feeling of admiration for that era of the past, and it's also wrapped up to a large degree in Christianity and in Christian beliefs. And many of the people who lean in this direction are traditional Catholics, and so that's their perspective, and then probably even Baptist if they're from the southern United States. But they're the ones who defend that old order, and some of them tend to be anti-capitalists for that reason. So like when I did my video on the gender pay gap, for example, I was talking about how I don't know if I did that in my video on the gender pay gap, but I did talk about how not all people who are on the right are pro-capitalist. And these guys would be, in a sense, anti-capitalist, because they would look at, say, the capitalist economy as having essentially degraded and destroyed the agrarian way of life, which in their mind it was a superior way of life as opposed to one which took technique and took consideration, whereas capitalism, in a sense, degrades everything and cheapens everything. Cheapens the quality of labor, cheapens the quality of life itself, in their view. So that's one view. Then there's a third view, which is a little bit more far to the right, a little bit more authoritarian, a little bit a little bit controversial. That I'm going to bring this up because it's wrapped up in a lot of things that are a little bit taboo, you know, and in this culture. But this third strand of this has really two schools of thought in a sense. There's the radical traditionalism of Julius Evola, who was a writer during the Nazi and fascist period. He was an Italian writer. He was from Sicily. He was a Sicilian nobleman, and he wrote a number of books, a number of articles, and a number of pamphlets of various kinds. And I don't claim to really be well schooled in his thought, but he was a fascinating writer for me, in a sense, because he wanted to go back over 1,000 years, and he wrote and he was critical of Christianity, and he was in a sense wanted to go back to something more pagan. He wanted to go back that far to something very pagan, and even tribal in a sense. And I don't know how I don't know all of what he wrote, but that was kind of the temperament of what he was writing about. And he was an esoterist and an occultist, and he had a perspective on the metaphysical and the spiritual that was unique. And this is what he was referring to. He wanted to go back to something in which it was everywhere, as opposed to where everything had spiritual, metaphysical significance. Whereas today, we don't believe in that at all, or at least that's how I'm understanding it. And so that's that. And then there's a second one, which is which is the revolutionary conservative movement of Germany. And these guys were writing prior to the rise of the Nazis during the Weimar period, and they were writing in response and in reaction to the defeat of Germany in World War I, the humiliation of the Versailles Treaty, and the sort of bourgeois liberal kind of situation in the Weimar Republic. They were writing, and they were frustrated that war didn't have the same significance that it had. The bravery of the warrior was being degraded. The greatness of Germany was going down to this bourgeois, mediocre kind of situation where everyone just kind of did whatever they wanted or whatever. And they were frustrated with the way things were going, and they wrote in reaction to this. And they wanted to have a revolution, in a sense, that would be founded on conservative principles. And it was interesting because there's a wide variety of different people writing, and some of them were more traditionally conservative in the sense that they were Catholic, they were Christian or whatever. And then there's others who attracted more nihilistic ideas. One thing that I think defined them, which was made them separate from the other conservatism of the Anglo-American tradition, is that they were more romantic, whereas the Anglo-American tradition is rooted, in more of a practical common sense, things of that nature. It's not really romantic. It's not really idealistic. But these guys were romantic in a sense. They were idealistic in a sense. They were attracted to some of them, like I said, were attracted to nihilistic ideas and things like that. And they wrote in a very interesting way because they wrote it was almost like an Old Testament, New Testament situation. They were writing about what they wanted the revolution to look like. And it sort of mirrored what happened with Adolf Hitler and the Nazis later. And it was almost kind of ironic in that sense. And they had many different ideas about what they wanted to do and how they wanted to go about doing that. So that was them. That was also wrapped up in the Volkisch movements of that day. It was various race sorts of situations and things, and some of them had their own theories on race. Some of them were even anti-Semitic, but they were ultimately very conservative, even in a sense reactionary. And when the Nazis eventually took over, they were suppressed. They were kept down because the Nazis did not want any reactionary or counter-revolutionary movements to occur. So they suppressed everything they could. And so that was them. But they were interesting because while some of them might have been Christian or whatever, they did have they did want to go, the morality, their moral code or whatever, in a sense, was something that they want to go back to something pre-Christian. And so there was that element. There was like almost a pagan element in them a little bit. And again, I don't claim to be very well versed in those ideas either, but I find them interesting. And the fact that I said all of these different things is it's kind of controversial because it sounds authoritarian, you know. But these are the sorts of things that could be seen as personifying ideas of traditionalism or conservatism. These three forms, and my own now to discuss my own take on all of this. Well, to begin with, the first one, the bourgeois, the mediocre, not particularly interesting. The mainstream conservative view, not particularly interesting. I support some of that in a way, but not really. I really can't say I would ever really vote for any Republicans. I've never really voted. I've never even voted for a Republican. So I'm not very interested in those mainstream boring ideas because I find them boring. I just find them not particularly interesting to me. So anyway, so then the other two is I like the more traditionally conservative view of Russell Kirk and Edmund Burke, but the problem with that is that I'm not a Christian. I don't follow the Christian religion. I'm not a Catholic. I don't follow the Christian faith in any way, shape, or form. And if I had to describe my religious or spiritual views as anything, because I have them, I'm not an atheist or an agnostic, I would describe them as pagan. If I had to describe them as anything, I would say they were pagan. I'm not a Christian. So I can't go along with the full-fledged aspect of it that's morally Christian or has a Christian outlook. I agree in the sense that, human nature is flawed, that human nature is sinful, whatever. I kind of agree with that in a sense, but ultimately, whereas they have almost a Puritan attitude about it, I see it as a form of liberation to know you're flawed or sinful. I see it as a form of liberation, whereas they would see it as a reason for increased discipline of human behavior or what have you. So that's them. That's that. And then there's the other one, and I like those ideas because they're intriguing. I find them interesting, and I find them to be, this is the third one I described. But ultimately, I'm not a racist. I don't have any interest in really. I don't have any really strong interest in racial ideas. I try to. I almost. The reason it took me so long to do this video is I almost didn't know if I wanted to discuss these guys because I didn't want to. Because it's always quick to be like, oh, you're a fascist, you're a Nazi. If you even if you're intrigued a little bit about some of those right wing ideas. And I don't want to be accused of being an authoritarian because actually I'm not. I'm really a believer in localism. I like patriotism more than nationalism. I would prefer a decentralized sort of socioeconomic relationship. I would prefer even going back to a more tribal kind of relationship, between people. I'm in a sense a neo-tribalist, and I'm also in a sense an anti-modernist, which seems crazy because hey, you're on YouTube, you're doing all these things, but it's a romantic thing. This is the thing people don't understand. I've talked to people about this before, and I've had people say to me, well, why would you feel that way? Why would you feel that way? But it's all a romantic thing. It's nice to let your mind wander and to want to have some sort of feeling of adventure or something like that. And so that's what I'm talking about when I say I feel this way. So that's really that. And I would probably also add that in terms of going back to these two perspectives, in terms of my own outlook, my own politics, because I describe myself as a centrist sometimes because I really don't fit into either the left or the right model. I mean, I have very complex views on a lot of issues. So I'll take time to discuss this a little bit. I really have, I would say, my practical views on the one hand and my idealism on the other. And the two are very different. I have my practicality, then I have the idealism, the romantic world that I like to go in sometimes and have fun with and daydream. I like that kind of stuff. I think we all need our fantasies, our daydreams, our myths, our legends, And we need something to stimulate our imagination, not just our intellect, but our imagination as well, or the irrational part of the brain as opposed to the rational part of the brain, or the scientific part of the brain. But I think I'm going to end here and talk to you later. Bye.